So welcome to this latest ACS cricket podcast. My name is John Broom, and today I'm going to be talking to Arunabha Sengupta, author of Elephant in the Stadium, a quite brilliant book about the Indian Test Tour of England in 1971, but about so much more beyond that. So the ACS, or to give it its full name, the Association of Cricket Statisticians and Historians, is a worldwide body based in the UK. It's open to anyone who's interested in the facts, or the figures, or the history of cricket, or just to anyone who loves cricket. New members of the association are always welcome, and we'll say more at that about the end about what the association does and how you can join it. But at any time, if you'd like to find out more about the ACS and what it offers to all cricket lovers, please visit the website at acscricket.com. And now, on with the show. So Aaron, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, so Elephant in the Stadium, a book that came out last year, I believe, in 2022. I remember reading it on holiday down in Dorset. It would have been unputdownable had I not been on holiday with my wife, who sometimes wanted me to put it down and do some holiday activities. But the book focuses on the Indian Tour of England of 1971 as its driving theme. So what made you choose that tour in particular? Because I guess for both of us, it falls just outside our living memory of the game of cricket.
Yeah, it falls just outside the living memory, as you say. And for me, I was not born yet in 71. But while growing up, and becoming interested in cricket, this was one tour that we couldn't avoid hearing about because it was always the path-breaking series where India won against England, and also just before that they had won West Indies. Those were the first two major series wins away from home, and we kept hearing about that, how incredible it was. And as I dug deep into it, as I became more interested in the recordings, in the reports, and the numbers, especially the numbers, I could see that a lot of the stories, they were snowballed out of proportion. The first time that a country wins somewhere, it tends to happen. I remember the first major series win during my lifetime was in England in 1986. And that was when India won 2-0 and Dilip Vengsarkar scored 200s in Lords and Leeds, and India won those test matches. And Mike Gatting became the captain in the middle of the series, taking over from David Gower. And when we were celebrating that series win, we obviously heard that this England team, it is a very weak side. That was the strongest side in the world at that time, 1971, and that was a series which cannot be compared to. They were incredible spinners who spun the ball square on seamers wickets and all that. And it was almost predestined to happen, predestined, like it was written in the stars that India would win in 71. Now, when I went back to the scorebooks and checked, it was not that great a team, So they were a good side. They had won the Ashes, which was kind of the be-all and end-all, even now sometimes. But if you look at the batting lineup, only John Edrich and Basil de Oliveira, they ended with 40-plus average in their test careers. And the other three who played in the Oval Test in the top order, Luckhurst, Fletcher, and Jameson, they did not average 40 with the bat. And that means that it was not that great a batting lineup, in my opinion. And also, if you look at it, Boycott, who was the best batsman of the team, he missed a couple of test matches, and Snow missed the second test due to very, very controversial reasons. The win was nothing as clinical as the win of 1986, because they were saved by the rain in the second test. The only time they were caught on a seamer's wicket, actually. They were being beaten. If it didn't rain, they would have been beaten fair and square. In the first test, it could have gone either way. And even in the final test at the Oval, England were on top for the first 3 days. And it was only a freak bowling spell by Chandrasekhar, who had not had that great a tour till then, which turned the table altogether. So, but the myths continued, and I figured out that all these cricketers, on that tour, they developed kind of like superhero powers, kind of impregnable, invincible auras. So it always tended to bother me. But when I came away from India and I started working abroad, and when I settled down in Netherlands and in Amsterdam, where I am now, it gave me the distance, it gave me the distance and the perspective to look at that part of history and find out why it was such an important event, so that myths were created around that tour. So even when I started writing for Cricket Country, which was a cricket website, in 2013, I wrote this on this day articles, and I covered the Oval Test. And the very experienced headline editor who wrote the headlines for me, he wrote that headline that the day India ended the home rule of England. And which I felt that it was quite over the top. We are just talking about a cricket match. But then when I looked back and I figured out what the situation was in 1971, India had been independent for just about 24 years. And the global image of India was not that great. Like we have political experts all the time, and the political experts were quite unanimous that the country wouldn't survive, there would be balkanization, and they were one of the poorest countries at that time. As far as cricket is concerned, they had gone to England several times. They had won nothing and lost most of their tests. After independence, they had lost all the tests except one, which had been drained off. So no one gave them much of a chance. And England, if you look at the opinion of the British at that time, on the day India played Warwickshire during the tour, there was this Australian-born British journalist, John Pilger, who interviewed Mrs. Gandhi. And the question she asked her was, a lot of British people are still congratulating themselves on exporting a Westminster sort of democracy to India. Now, but given the hunger, the poverty, do the people of India really think of themselves as being a democracy or as a part of the democracy? Now, this is a very fair question from the point of view of the hunger, the poverty. We couldn't deny that. But at the same time, we should remember that the Indians thought of themselves as a nation that had been subjugated for so long, and they had won freedom from their rulers, their oppressors, after a lot of struggle. And if you say that we were proud of exporting the Westminster democracy, there is a definite mismatch. We need to remember the Indian team, they were paid a daily allowance of £3 per day during the 71 tour. And that was a huge increment from £1 per day that they received in 1967. So yes, so there were a lot of these issues. The India's global image was such. Even the Indians didn't play themselves on Western movies depicting Indians. So Peter Sellers used to paint himself black and use an Indian accent, and that was accepted, not an actual Indian playing an Indian's role. So yeah, there were a lot of reasons for which the Indian batsmen were already on the back foot even before John Snow ran in.
So you already said there we've moved from talking about the cricket and being at Edgbaston, we've moved on to Mrs. Gandhi and John Pilger, very renowned journalist and campaigner. So how did you set about going about the research for this book? Because there's a huge array of information, both from the usual cricketing sources, but also from geopolitics, culture, the British Empire, you name it, it's there. So how did you set your parameters, as it were?
Yeah, my idea was, yes, the cricket was very important because it is ultimately a cricket book. But at the same time, there had to be the exploration of the relationship between the two countries, India and England, India and Britain as such. And the relationship is quite complex it has evolved over time. There was the entire history of colonization and independence, partition, and also what happened after that, both from the social point of view, the opening up of the economy of India, and also from the cricket point of view with the power center now being IPL and all that. So, so all these points needed to be covered. And I also had to talk about cricket. So one thing was to interpose the different matches that was taking place in the tour inside the book with these different pieces flowing in. I had a definite list of things I needed to talk about, a timeline. But if I just went away from cricket and then came back to cricket, it would seem very unstructured. So there were segues so that I could flow into that. That took some doing, but
there are some wonderful segues there. I was just looking before this interview. I was looking at the Essex match. So just beforehand, we're with Lionel Tennyson in 1937-8. We're hunting big game out there.
Yep.
Then we're on a cold June day in Colchester with John Lever putting the Indians to the sword. The next minute, we're collecting cigarette cards at the height of the British Empire. It really is a magnificent troll through history, to say, with that central spine of the cricket running through it, but with so many segues that really add to the story, but then bring you back to the central theme of the tour. So it must have taken quite a lot of imagination to make it all fit together in such a cohesive narrative.
Yeah, it was the main challenge was to flow out of the cricket and into the cricket again, without making it seem unstructured.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of references that I collected, a lot of books, newspaper articles mainly. And I also had a lot of interviews with some cricketers of both the countries who did not play in that series. The reason for that is those cricketers, some of them are no longer with us, some of them are not too eager to say stuff, and they have been repeating themselves for over 50 years. I don't think we have anything new to hear from them. And if we hear something new, that's after dinner speech effect. That was very important for me, that did not play in that series, but they were more modern cricketers, you can say. And also some of the people who lived in England during that time, who were perhaps at the Oval on that day, and who had experienced the times, and people from India, from East Pakistan, Bangladesh, where this situation was very volatile, and also from England, whose memory of the Indian-Pakistani war, that is not so prominent, but they remember the problems in Ireland, Belfast, and all that. So
that's one of the, as a sort of historian myself, it really takes you back to that time where Britain was on the edge of dipping its toe into the common market, as you say, the troubles in Northern Ireland, and then we move over to the turmoil around Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and then we're back at a cricket match, an old-fashioned tournament. Really is wonderful the way it all meshes together. But one of the themes that you keep returning to throughout the book is how cricket historiography, the way cricket's been perceived and written about over the years, is excessively Anglo or Anglo-Australian centric. So can you elaborate a bit more on this point?
Yeah, it has been long-standing being my bonnet. So I remember reading Don Bradman's Farewell to Cricket at the age of 9, and one particular sentence still sticks out, right? That Leonard Hutton, he called him not Len Hutton, but Leonard Hutton and Dennis Compton, they scored centuries in their first test matches. They were playing their first test matches and scored centuries at Trent Bridge. And it really jarred with me, because I knew they were not making their test debut. Trent Bridge was not their debut. Both of them had played earlier. But when I went back and looked at it, and it took me several years actually to figure out that Bradman was talking about the first test against Australia, which was all that mattered. And that was 1938. And 1938 again, when at the Oval, Hutton scored 364, and he broke the world record. And most of the newspapers of the day, they congratulated him on going past Bradman's 334 at Leeds, and not Hammond's 336, because it had been scored against New Zealand. So at that time, it was Ashes was kind of everything to do, like Test cricket was all about Ashes. And it made sense probably at that time, because England and Australia were the only two major powers playing Test cricket. But if you take the 1950s, it didn't make real sense anymore from the pure objective point of view. It did not make sense anymore. Or West Indies was coming up in a big way. South Africa were getting in strength. And by the 70s, 80s, it was really quite funny that people still considered Ashes the major contest, because by the 80s, it was more of a battle for the wooden spoon, you know, before Australia recovered and became one of the strongest team once more. But this Ashes, it kind of not only are there more books written about Ashes, more coverage given to Ashes than any other bilateral series, it kind of our perceptions also are somewhat skewed by the Ashes. For example, Lilly and Thompson, we hear a lot about them bowling together, terrorizing the batsman. If you look at the numbers, Lilly and Thompson in the Ashes, they average 22. When they bowl against England, they are brilliant when they bowl together against England. When they bowl together against other countries, their average is a lot higher. You know, but the folklore is that Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So, and this is not only about Lilly and Thompson, and not only about Ashes, I would say. Ashes, I have already given the example in the book. For example, the Coronation Ashes, 5 test matches, and England winning 1-0. Along with the Coronation that took place in 53, it was kind of hugely publicized, and there was a lot of hype around it. And there were about 13 books written about that Ashes series itself. And at the same time, just the previous winter, the Indian team had traveled to the West Indies for the first time. It was a historic tour, because they traveled for the first time. And not only that, it was a great meeting of people, because there were the Guyanese and the Trinidadian Indians who had traveled about 100 years back as indentured laborers. And they were meeting their own people for the first time. So the Indian team was hugely popular, and there were a lot of different celebrations that became extremely popular. And even what happened was they played 5 test matches as well, and the result was 1-0 again. And they played some brilliant cricket there. There is no book written about this particular Indian tour. And so that has always been the case. And as I said, in 1938, we can still understand Bradman having this perception that Ashes is everything about cricket. But if you make the same sort of assumption in 2018 or 2023, that is a bit of a problem. If you see Brad Hogg, he says that Ashes will fire the public imagination much more than any test championship. Or when England had come down to India the last time and they lost 3-1, they had rotated their players. They had used the rotation policy. And Michael Vaughan had said that if England continued to rotate their players during the Ashes, that will be the death of Test cricket. Now, India were the #1 ranked team at that time. So rotating the players against Australia is a blasphemy, but not against the #1 ranked team in the world. So that doesn't make sense. So yes, there is a huge amount of rivalry. I have myself written a book on Ashes, which is
yes, got that one, yes.
But yeah. But then, I mean, I understand it's a long rivalry, but there are other rivalries as well. And if you look at the last 50 years, other rivalries have been a much more well-contested rivalries. So yeah, keep like celebrating Ashes. There's no doubt about it. It's a great contest, but it is not the like be all and end all of cricket. Even now, if you go to some cricket like groups, there are people who analyze, make statistical analysis of, say, different cricketers, comparing around eras, all those things that amateur statisticians keep doing.
Yeah.
And to do that, they sometimes take English and Australian cricketers, which is essentially doing away with 6 of the top 10 run getters and 7 of the top 10 wicket takers. That's you have to come out of that.
So, I mean, one of the central themes in Elephant in the Stadium is the impact of British colonial history on the political, cultural, and sporting relations between India and England. So how much of that you just referred to, this relentless focus on the Ashes, is impacted by that history of the British relationship with the Indian subcontinent and the Raj?
I'd say it is a bit of both. And apart from that, it is not only restricted to cricket as well. You see history being written with a Western focus or a Anglo-American focus. And that's also something that I mentioned in the book once, that we were talking about the explosive situation in East Pakistan. And a lot of it came up or evolved due to the student rebellions that you saw in Pakistan in 1968. And 1968, if you remember, is when the whole world went through lots and lots of students' rebellions all over the world. It was taking place. Now, if you read any sort of social history and or socio-political history of the world during that time, 1968, the what you glean from most of the accounts is that all these student rebellions took place mainly in Western Europe and US, which was not the case. I mean, same things were going on in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. So this sort of problem with writing history, and that is there throughout. And it's not only about Ashes, it's also about the way cricket is documented in by different reporters, by different journalists in countries. So, for example, Vinu Mankad in 1952, he in that Lord's Test, he scored 75, 180 and took 5 wickets. It's gone down as Mankad's Test, and everybody knows about that. It was played against England at Lord's. But 10 years down the line, Polly Umriger had a similar sort of feat in West Indies, century, half century, and 5 wickets. But it was in West Indies, far away from the reputed journalists writing about the game. So we don't quite recall that he had a similar feat. But that particular test at Lord's, even though India had lost, it's still called the Mankad's Test. So it's a lot about who writes the history, in what way history is written, and so on.
So in some ways, do you see Elephant in the Stadium as an insurgent book? It's coming, it's there with absolutely beautifully researched and written reports of the different matches. You say you interview people who attended some of the test matches, but in the way it sort of positions the test series within a broader landscape, do you see it as a bit of an insurgent book in terms of traditional cricket historiography?
Yes, I would say that. And I've made a lot of points in the book, which may be a bit difficult to digest in a lot of the cricketing communities. For example, I have made the point about language, language and the way history is written again. In India, for example, there are hundreds of languages which are spoken by more than 10,000 people. And without knowing that these languages, it may be that you don't get to understand the culture totally. But that sort of a problem does not really affect a person who grows up in India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka, And when he tries to learn about England, everybody knows the language. People growing up there, they know the language, the educated people. But if you look at the books that have been written about subcontinent, there have been lots of Western authors, Anglo-Australian authors who have written about India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka. You don't see the thing happening the other way. And it is still that sort of like an inertia, historical inertia, I can say, because historically, because of the like balance of power or the colonization, it was always the West who wrote the history of the colonized subjects. So there we do have this sort of issue. For example, I write about decolonization, and decolonization, I have to dwell on, say, people like Anthony Eden and the subsequent prime ministers of England and their policies and so on. So one particular gentleman, one particular critic, while being quite laudatory about the book, he said that, did we really need that lecture on Eden and the fumbling of the following prime ministers and the domestic government? Now, which tells me that the people are not very comfortable with somebody born in the colonies. He actually talking about something that is done in the British political scene.
Has that been a general reaction to the book, or has it been generally positive and well received?
Generally, it has been positive. Generally, it has been positive, and it was also shortlisted for the Critics Writers Club Book of the Year award. Also, in Times, it was noted as the best cricket book of the year. So generally, it has been positive, but there have been this sort of odd reactions, or I'll elaborate about that. There was one particular reviewer who remarked that he probably dwells too much on colonialism, and the point about colonialization has been already made, hasn't it? Now, that's a very odd reaction, because if you talk about the British curriculum, people are just starting to know that it was not absolutely pristine. So very recently, I had this experience of a British family visiting us in Amsterdam, and I was taking them around. There were the parents and two kids, kids aged about 12 and 8. And I was taking them around the World War II sites in Amsterdam. And because I'm from India, one of the kids asked me that, did the Indians, were the Indians affected by the Second World War? And the father immediately said, I don't think so. And now I had to explain to them that there were 2.5 to 3 million Indians who fought in the Second World War. And during the Asian side of the war, the eastern side of the war, Japanese were running over Singapore. They occupied Burma, and they were bombing Calcutta. People from Calcutta had to evacuate. And also, there's the other factor that because of this threat of Japanese invasion, there was the denial policy, which had been a British government decision. And because of that, 3 million Bengalis died. And you have Winston Churchill's famous comment that Bengalis breed like rabbits. So it's no big deal if some of them die. But all these things are not known to a lot of people. And when I was talking about that, the kids, they actually asked me, are you talking about the Bengal famine? While it was all news to the father, which tells me that very recently, this particular episode of history that has been made known to the younger children in their curriculum probably, but it is still not known to the parents, to the father. So to say that the story of colonialism is already been told, or the point has already been made, that's quite ridiculous, I would say.
And I think to say any history has been written, we can draw a line under it, is not what we understand as historians to be history. So we've done what we said the book does. We've started with the cricket, we've segued into all sorts of wonderful side alleys, but let's return to the cricket itself. So a narrow series win for India against England, who held the Ashes, the all-important Ashes at the time. So was it a series that swung sort of both ways? Was it on a knife edge right to the end, or was it a case of England holding on until the inevitable Indian triumph? How did the test series play out?
As I said, it was quite well balanced and a lot of dependent on luck. The first test, for example, India had a chance and they were set a very low target, and they had the full day to get it, but then there were rains and there was a possibility of rain, and they tried to get it quicker, and they were 8 down when with a few runs to make. And one of the remaining batsmen was Chandrasekhar, who not really very good with the bat. So the rains came down during tea, and the match was drawn. So it could have gone either way. And in the second test, that's the only test that India played on a seaming surface. They were totally outplayed, and England were on the verge of winning it when again the rains came down and saved India. And in the second test, we also have to say that during the chase, the thrilling chase of the first test, there was this collision between Snow and Gavaskar, which really resulted in Snow being suspended for the second test, or dropped for the second test, and he went and wrote some poetry about it, but which looked like poetry from a distance, I said. But then, so there was this luck factor playing as well, because if Snow had played, probably England would have won by even in spite of the rain. And in the third test, England held the upper hand for 3.5 days. Up till lunch on the fourth day, England were on top, and they had a big first innings lead. And then there was this freak spell from Chandrasekhar. And 6 wickets for 36, which is one of the best spells in history. And England were bowled out for 101. And then after that, it became India's game. But even then, it was a battle of attrition on the last day. It was very slow progress, and it was quite riveting till the last ball.
So the cricket itself is fascinating. Certainly the context within which it's taking place is fascinating. So we say you've managed to ruffle a few feathers along the way in challenging people's preconceptions of what cricket history should be and what cricket history isn't. So it takes us through many different periods, through the cultural worlds, political worlds, the key social axes in British and Indian history. It's a remarkable book. As you say, it's been shortlisted for many awards, and deservedly so. It's written with pace, it's crisp, it's pacey, it never loses that central theme, whilst segueing, as you say, into many fascinating different side alleys. You've written several books about cricket. Would you say this is the one of which you're most proud?
It's difficult to say, because one of the books that I wrote in 2015, it was fiction, and it was about Sherlock Holmes and the Birth of the Ashes, and I put Holmes and Watson in that Ashes oval test. And that, to me, it took a lot of creativity putting them there. And the thing about it was everything that happened, apart from the dialogue of Holmes and Watson, they actually happened on the day. I used all the events of the day to make that mystery, build that mystery around it. Sherlock Holmes and the Birth of the Ashes, it was satisfying in its own way. It was challenging because there was a lot of creativity involved. Here, it was, again, something that I really wanted to write about, and something because I had experienced a lot of things regarding 1971, and also the changing attitudes between countries, the way cricket writing and cricket history is viewed, and how it gets skewed in different ways as well. Similarly, Apartheid, A Point to Cover, that was also a book which required a lot of in-depth study. I was quite shaken while doing the research for that as well, because it affected me in different ways. So all the books are have their own special place, but this one was very important. I can say this was very important for a number of reasons.
Well, thank you for speaking to us this afternoon, Aaron. Elephant in the Stadium, which I have my copy here, well-thumbed copy. Absolutely brilliant book. Really should be on every cricket lover's shelf. It's one I've read from cover to cover, and I'll keep referring to again and again because of the brilliant nuggets that it holds. So congratulations on a fantastic book, and thank you for speaking about it to us today. So this podcast has been prepared on behalf of the Association of Cricket Statisticians and Historians, but the views expressed by the participants are, of course, our own, and are not necessarily shared by the ACS as a whole or by its individual members. ACS celebrates its 50th birthday this year. In that time, it has led the way in establishing a definitive list of first-class matches to act as a baseline for all statisticians, as well as carrying out detailed research into a huge range of subjects relating to the history and statistics of the game. The association has also published over 500 books on the facts, figures, and personalities of cricket. In addition, on our website, you can find what we believe to be the most complete and up-to-date listing of records of both men's and women's cricket in all formats of the game. And there's much more besides, so why not take a look at acscricket.com for yourself. The website also tells you how you can join the association. If you'd like to do so, it's very straightforward. We look forward to welcoming new members wherever you live, and whatever your level of interest or involvement in the great game of cricket. And we would welcome your questions or feedback on matters from today's podcast about the ACS itself. Meanwhile, don't forget to listen out to our next podcast coming soon.